This is the story of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. His life began in Lambeth in London in 1925, and as our last episode ended, he had gone through his childhood years. He's described his career on the trains, his participation in the war effort as the supplies and personnel were being prepared in his what would become his hometown and in preparation for D-Day. And he also described meeting my nan and getting married. As the story continues, he is now well into adult life with a family to provide for, and now trying to find what would become a vocation for most of the rest of his working years. I tried many jobs for the next year or two, but I could never really settle down. I didn't have any real training for anything else. There was a lot of activity going on at Greenham Common, and a friend of mine had gotten a job in maintenance. He told me there were plenty of jobs there, so I took the plunge and applied for a job. It was 1955, and I registered with the AFEX Services, the American Forces Exchange. I was seriously vetted for past conduct and nationality, etc., and after about a month, I was accepted. I was photographed and issued with my own identity card. I swore allegiance to the forces and signed an oath to secrecy. I felt now that I was in Little America once I got inside the gates. I call them the gates, but in actual fact it was only a pole counterbalanced with a lump of concrete, which the MP raised or lowered. There were very few buildings to be seen. The first one finished was the huge green hangar on the right as you entered the base. Opposite was a prefabricated building which became the PX, and several other prefabricated buildings further up the base. There was a great deal of building work going on. Anyway, I had a job in the Green Building, which was to become the main receiving and issuing depot for all PX cells. It was truly another Aladdin's cave, with military badges, uniforms, household linen, and genuine US clothing. Such items we had never seen in our lives. I was in charge of all the military stores, and I was in my element. I took great interest in what I was doing, and took time and trouble to learn all the insignia and ranks. Having done so, I was able to treat everyone with the rank they deserved. I also earned respect from them. Probably the only drawback from that job was the continual inventory taken. It was also always very hard to reach the right figures for the audits. We were continually being visited by the bosses from headquarters, led by a Mr. Julius Kaplan, a name I will never forget. He was very unkind to us, and I felt his personal views were very unchristian. We had a difficulty balancing the books one day, and had one of his usual visits. We sat and deliberated for hours and did several spot checks, but he was not satisfied. The supervisor casually remarked that his figures were there for him to see, and that figures don't lie. No, Mr. Kaplan said, but liars can figure. That shook us all, and we protested loudly. His final remark was something to the effect that the limeys had gotten it all wrong, and we were all guilty until proven innocent. He was a horrible man. The base was gradually taking shape now, and the barracks were up. Headquarters was also underway, as were the roads on the base. And then came 1956, and I had my first assessment on the 9th of July. I was promoted to storeman in charge, and my pay rose from £7, £7.60 to £7.15. I suppose it wasn't too bad. I went on working hard and enjoying my work. On one visit from Mr. Kaplan, he brought a group of people with him who were all heads of various departments. They were assessing the future of AFEX, becoming more effective in serving the base. Among these people was a Miss Haggerty, who was responsible for base food services. She took me to one side and said the next project would be the opening of a snack bar. She wondered if I'd be interested in receiving proper training to run the snack bar for them, and I jumped at the chance. Eventually, I was sent to train in Cheshire, where I lodged, and then reported to a base at Sealand, a port where all the huge container ships arrived. They had a marvellous snack bar for our practical work and a classroom for theory. It was an intensive course which covered all aspects of running a snack bar. Most important was the training in cleanliness and hygiene. We had lectures every evening, and when they were satisfied we had the staying power, we had to run the snack bar for 3 days each. There were 5 of us taking the course. It lasted for 3 weeks, and in that time I did all I could to pass my exams. I had no leave, and it was the first time I had ever been parted from my wife, Olive. I wrote regularly, but in those days there was no question of being able to phone. I was lonely and missed her terribly, but I had to knuckle down and do my work. Well, I was successful and came home to Newbury and Greenham. The snack bar was virtually finished, and I was given 14 days to recruit staff, start initial training, and be ready for opening. It was a colossal task, and I couldn't see how I was possibly going to be ready in time. But I was saved. The base had not gotten a medical team ready to give examinations and tests to the staff. All the fittings in the bar were very basic. I had a cake display unit, a hot steam table, a griddle, and a cool box for cold drinks. So at that stage, the snack bar was easy to run. As more and more troops arrived, it became totally inadequate. We eventually had a whole squad of US engineers on base, as well as a squad of Air Force personnel. The engineers were doing the construction work, and the Air Force people were doing the communication side of things. In the meantime, business was getting intolerable and making service very difficult. My PX officer was Captain Fairchild, who was a lovely man. I built up a great rapport with him, and we became friends. He was a senior pilot and had spent his war service flying over the Burma hump. He even had his own Dakota parked just outside the snack bar, so my interest was greatly increased. He did a lot of flying to maintain his flying hours. The plane was serviced by a team from Bryce Norton, and one day after such a service, Captain took me for a flight around the circuit of the base. He called it an incentive bonus. We also had a general manager who was a proper nutcase. He was Mr. A.E. Brown. He used to strut around the base with a short swagger stick under his arm, sometimes waving it about like an RS Major. The girls in the snack bar were terrified of him. I don't know what his background was, but he certainly had a military bearing. Anyway, he found out that I was a GWR man, and I was in. We spent all our spare time discussing trains. He was also a very good photographer, and I used to find good places for him to get the best pictures. He also did a lot of photography in the United States of American engines. He published them into a book, and I have a copy to this day. It is entitled Locomotives and Trains of Kansas City, Louisiana, and Arkansas Railways. It was published in Leesville, Louisiana. Inside, it has an inscription to Langridge of the Great Western, finest railway in the world, 22nd of May, 1956. What a treasure. Anyway, with Captain Fairchild and Mr. Brown on my side, pressure was put on Aphex to refurbish the whole snack bar. To enable this to be done, they sent down 2 mobile snack bars. My staff were found jobs in other departments, while I and my dear friend Peggy drove a mobile unit each. We had great fun. Peggy was a beautiful person in her manner and care for others. She had a very aristocratic appearance, and her voice was very educated. The boys were in awe of her and thought a great deal of her. Any bad jokes or foul language in her presence was stopped immediately. She would raise herself to her full stature and tell them off like naughty boys. The GIs loved it and would tease her just to get her going. She would have no nonsense from any of them, and they had great respect for her. Our friendship went on long after we both left the base. In fact, she married Master Sergeant Don Staffex, and they lived in a cottage in Ashford Hill. Sadly, Peggy lost her beloved Donald quite some time ago, and she lived a lonely life in sheltered housing, finally joining Don in 1998 in their heaven. Soon the snack bar was ready, and when I first saw it, I was totally amazed. Everything was stainless steel, and I had a chilling cabinet for salads, a super grill plate, a Bon Marie serving table, a hot dog machine, and an espresso coffee machine. But the creme de la creme was my own superb soda fountain. It was sheer luxury and a great pleasure to use. That was the good side. But I was in for a rude awakening. As we became more established, the more we became involved with the vets and their strict hygiene expectations. More of that later. We now had full manpower on base, and everybody was working very hard. The US government had put a deadline on the completion date, and they were all working long hours. There was a lot of tension on base, not least of all, but because of a lack of racial harmony. It was very nasty at times and often resulted in fights. In fact, it got so bad that the base commander had to put a curfew on all troops. But when that didn't work, he made them leave base on separate nights. There were random searches at the gate, which unfortunately went against the colored boys. They were detained just long enough to miss their bus into Newbury, and when the coloured MPs were on the gate, if they dared to delay the white boys, there would be more trouble again. Each side would arm themselves with inconspicuous weapons. The most prolific tool was the beer can opener. The pointed end was carefully filed, and it became a serious weapon nicknamed the churchyard key. They also would use the bed adjuster. It really was becoming an untenable situation, and security was being strengthened all the time. It was the beginning of the dreadful occurrence later on in Little Rock, Arkansas. The English staff carried on as normal and treated everybody equally. During the lighter moments, we had plenty of laughs. One day, a young GI came into the snack bar and had soot on his forehead. One of the girls said, "Excuse me, sir, but you've got a dirty head." None of us knew that it was a cross, a tradition of Ash Wednesday. Then there was Bridie, an Irish lady who did the washing up. It was before the chapel had been built, so we had frequent visits from the local Catholic priest. When Bridie heard this, she would run a mile. She had missed several masses. We also had a jukebox installed, and it was something we had never imagined. It was like something out of the future. One day it was playing one of the top tunes of the day. One of the lads grabbed the young lady who was clearing the tables and started jitterbuggering. It was all very strange to us. Anyway, who should walk in but the base commander? I really thought I had had it, but he was quite charming and said how good it was to relieve tension and boost morale. Before the bar was modernized, I had employed a chef to serve meals from the front line. I was in the office doing my paperwork and audit, ready for an impending visit from Mr. K. Well. I walked out of the office to see how the dinner-time rush was going when I nearly had a fit. There was the chef standing on the line in greasy-looking trousers and a singlet vest, with what he called a sweat rag hanging around his neck. He looked like a ship's stoker rather than a cook. Naturally, I took him to one side and explained that there was no way he could serve food like that. He was furious, saying that I was only a kid. I knew nothing, and he had done a lifetime in the merchant navy. I was still wet around the ears. And with that, he stormed out of the snack bar, and that was that. My next chef was for real. He was very smart and extremely polite. He had been a submariner, a German, and an ex-prisoner of war. His cooking was superb, and the GIs loved it. His Wiener Schnitzel, a meatloaf, and pork escallops were great favorites. He could marinate rabbit and cook it so that it was more like chicken. Unfortunately, as we became more equipped, it became less necessary for the chef's work. Our friendly Mr. K decided we were not a restaurant, but a snack bar. If the GIs wanted cooked meals, they had the mess hall. We had to stick to cooking grilled foods only. We had a huge chip fryer, a larger bain-marie, and we now served chili con carne, which was fabulous. Lima beans, baked beans, and wonderful soups. It was all very exciting. I had to keep a strict eye on the staff, though. They were only allowed one hamburger and one scoop of chips per meal, and it had to be recorded on our sales sheet. I was working on a 32% gross profit, and after wages, food expenses, etc., I had to realize a 17% profit with 1% allowed for pilferage and loss. It was a very difficult target to meet, and I had to rely on a good staff with a very strict portion control and very little waste. At the end of the day, Simon, our chef, did very well. He was offered a job by the base commander to work in his private house as chef and maintenance man. He eventually went to the States with the colonel. The next biggest temptation I had for my staff was the soda fountain. With 5 flavors of ice cream, which was unheard of, and the wonderful toppings, it was quite a job to keep their hands off. It was a treat for them when the GIs would pay for a dessert for them. We had an open day on base as a public relations scheme, and a special concession was made for the blokes to buy American foods. All proceeds went to Cold Ash Children's Home. Anyway, I managed to get Olive onto the base and into the snack bar. I made her a banana split, and I can see the look on her face to this day. I gave her the works: banana, dark chocolate sauce, butterscotch, cherry, marshmallow, and chopped nuts. She still remembers it 40 plus years later. When you think of the austere years we had gone through and the rationing that was still going on, is it any wonder that such unusual and rare ingredients were such a temptation? Then we had a popcorn machine. What's popcorn? And even our own donut machine with all the flavorings. It never ceased to amaze us. One day we were all very busy doing preparation and cleaning for the next visit from the vets, and suddenly there was an almighty scream from one of the girls. They had pulled the fridge away from the wall, and there was a huge cockroach. We had never seen one before, and sure enough, where there was one, there were two, three, four, or hundreds. We were infested. That was it. We were closed. Under close supervision of the vets, we had to move everything, scrub, disinfect, and literally tear the place apart. Peggy had to park her mobile out in front and serve coffee, etc. from there. This lasted a fortnight before the vets were satisfied. Even then, they didn't let up on daily visits. Naturally, there was a base and AFEX inquiry into this. Unfortunately, they decided it was no fault of ours. The larvae of these creatures must have been in the hollows and paneling of various equipment. This was confirmed later when the NCO club suffered the same. Despite all these setbacks and the hard work to maintain such high standards, I loved my work and was extremely happy to be involved with the US forces. We were beginning to look like a real base now. The flight line and surrounding areas were virtually finished, the control tower was up, the perimeter fencing completed, and construction work was being concentrated on the base facilities. The NCO Club was a beautiful building, and no expense had been spared inside. It was quite lavish. There was a cinema, albeit just a tin hut, a library, and a Stars and Stripes paper shop. Headquarters was finished, and we had a fully operational fire department. My wages had increased, and I was up a couple of promotions, but we still found it hard to make ends meet. So I looked for overtime. The first job I tried was in the bowling alley. It was only a single lane effort, but the pins were picked up by hand. The essence of the job was to be quick and correct all the time. Well, I gave it a try, but there was no way I could keep up with the speed at which the players were expecting, so I had to quit and look for some other source of income. I had mentioned this at various times to my NCO friends, and eventually they offered work at the NCO club. It was smashing. I really became more involved with the men and soon earned respect and offers of more work. The NCOIC was Master Sergeant Hoffman, who was a hard taskmaster but extremely friendly to me. He appreciated everything I did, and after a term of long employment, he made me an honorary member. But of course, I was not allowed to purchase any drinks. It meant that Olive and I were able to attend many of the shows that were put on, and that was how we were introduced to country and western. These were marvelous evenings for us. They made us feel so welcome and treated us like royalty. One evening they had a raffle, and I won a prize. It was a set of 6 Seagram VO whiskey glasses. It caused a bit of a stir among the staff as to whether I was allowed to keep them. We were, and were so proud to own these rarities. Unfortunately, I have only one glass left now, and it has a place of pride in our china cabinet even after over 40 years. The next big event to take place for me was the building of a large snack bar extension, which was to become a beer bar. The idea was to provide a facility on base so that the young GIs didn't have to go downtown. They even provided 2 lorries that run a shuttle service from town to base to bring up the young ladies who were allowed as guests in the NCO club and the service club, but never in my beer bar. We had every make of beer that was available with names we had never heard before, all kept chilled in 4 cabinets. The GIs hated warm beer. Tension was still rife on base now, and it was becoming more prevalent between the Air Force and the Army. I think it was wrong to bring women on base, as it was causing rivalry. Anyway, one night we had a very full bar, and a lot of drinking was going on. I had 2 barmen, Charlie and George. Charlie was a big man in his 40s, but very fit. He had previously served in a guards regiment. He was quite able to take care of himself and controlled the bar with a rod of iron. If he decided that the young lad had had enough to drink, that was it. He would not get any more. George was a slightly built man, but very wiry, and he also would stand no nonsense. Well, this particular night, the bar had separated into 2 groups, and there was a lot of going back and forth, sometimes getting very heated. Charlie pressed an alarm button that we had between the 2 bars, so I went to see what was wrong. On the left-hand side were a group of engineers who had drawn 2 tables together, and there was quite a party going on. One of the groups had started collecting their cans and was building a pyramid. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, came a salt cruet and knocked these cans flying. Well, that was it. Everything broke loose. There was one big, fierce, bloody fight. Everything went flying. Chairs, tables, pictures from off the wall, and even the jukebox was wrecked. In fact, by the time the MPs arrived, the whole bar was wrecked. It looked like a battlefield. The next morning, the base commander demanded every man to be on parade. He gave a very strict speech to them and then marched every one of them up to the base and to the beer bar to see the damage. Every man on base was fined according to their rank and confined to base. The beer bar was closed for repairs and kept closed until the situation improved, which was about a month later. When it did reopen, it was on a very strict time limit and under constant MP patrols. I was enjoying life as much as ever and enjoying my overtime at the NCO club. I was invited to a leaving party by a staff sergeant, and the celebration was terrific. But unfortunately, the lads thought it was a good idea to lace my beer with vodka and other spirits. I ended up being very ill and suffered from alcohol poisoning. It took days for me to recover. That was an unfortunate incident, but it never ruined my respect for and admiration of the US forces. While I was working in the bar, many of the NCOs left their small change as a tip for me. I knew I wasn't allowed it, but I had a friendly NCO who would change it for me. We really were desperate for extra cash. One day, while at work, we had a visit from the OSI. The name struck terror through us, and there I was with US money in my wallet. I was petrified. I could picture myself in court and then being jailed. However, I needn't have worried, as they were only there to examine money in the till and safe, looking for counterfeit currency. Apparently there was a huge black market going on in Germany, and dollars were fetching big prices, so fake dollars were flooding the market. To counteract this, the US government decided to issue all bases with script money, which was to be the only currency allowed. It was useless anywhere else except the base, and it also ended my tips. Communication was very sparse on base in the early days. The post office engineers were working flat out, wiring every office and every workshop. And then there were the billets that had to be wired into the base exchange. It was before the times of computer chips or digital, and it was a mammoth task. So in the meantime, the main source of information was through a tannoy speaker system, which worked quite well. One such occasion was at the end of the day when the flag was lowered. A bugle sounded over the tannoy, and no matter where you were or what you were doing, you stopped and turned towards the flag. Men in uniform saluted, and civilians stood to attention. I can remember standing there like a statue, paying respect to the occasion. Anyone failing to do so could be turned in by any NCO in the vicinity, and that really did worry me. There was no way I wanted to lose my job. Unfortunately, that was one of the many traditions that was dropped at a later stage. Another use for the tannoy was during safety week. Any accident or mishaps were reported, especially road conditions. Whenever there were fatal road accidents, the cars or motorcycles involved would be on display outside the main gates. It was meant as a rude warning to all. However, due to the inexperience of driving in Britain and the speed on our very narrow country roads, accidents became prevalent. There were slogans printed on boards placed at intervals all along the main road through base, such as "Slow up today, show up tomorrow," or "Kill your speed, not yourself." But this brutal method of making the point known was also dropped. The tannoy was also used on festive occasions such as Easter and Christmas. Such beautiful music was played, especially at Christmas. Between every two poles or trees, lights were hung. The lads had decorated the billet windows, and an illuminated cross was erected outside HQ. It was all very primitive, but such an effort had been made that it was appreciated by everybody. The annex building was opened as a Christmas toy shop. It was wonderful. I provided mince pies and coffee, and so was privileged to be allowed into the shop. The toys were beyond belief. Who ever heard of a bassinet or little four-wheeled trolleys? I spent a lot of spare time wandering around, not daring to touch anything. The only regret I had was never being able to own one of the Lionel train sets. My friend and general manager was about to leave the base soon, to be posted in the USA, but before he went, he made an offer that gave me a lot of food for thought. He had the idea of opening a restaurant of his own in Louisiana, and he wanted me to manage it. He thought having a bloke in charge would be an added attraction and hopefully swell the trade. Well, Olive and I thought about this offer long and hard. We talked of it being the chance of a lifetime and a new life in the land of milk and honey. But finally we agreed that we would stay and look after our parents.